The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like swallowing stone. The underground mines stretched endlessly, dark and heavy, with walls that dripped water from cracks above. Chains clinked every time the slaves moved, echoing against the cold stone. Among them was a girl, thin and pale, her body covered in bruises from years of hard work and punishment. She carried heavy rocks from one end of the tunnel to the other, her legs shaking with every step, yet no one cared if she collapsed. If she slowed down, the guards' whips would strike her back until she screamed. Her days were all the same. Wake up in the dark, work until her body burned, eat scraps that barely counted as food, and then sleep on the cold ground. She did not remember what sunlight felt like anymore. Her people had been taken long ago, and the only life she knew now was this endless slavery. The smell of sweat, blood, and stone never left her. Hope was something she had forgotten, buried under years of chains. The guards were brutal. They shouted in a language she hated, treating her and the others like animals. Sometimes, when someone grew too weak, they were beaten until they moved again. If they couldn't, their body was dragged away and never seen again. No one dared ask where they were taken. Silence was safer. Work was survival. She had learned to keep her head down, to never meet the eyes of her captors. But inside, she still carried a small spark of anger. She hated the chains. She hated the darkness. Sometimes, when she was alone in the tunnels, she would press her hand against the cold stone and imagine breaking free. But the dream always died quickly. There was no way out. There was no savior. No one even knew she existed down here. That night, after another long day of pain, she lay on the hard ground with dozens of other slaves around her. The dim lamps flickered, making shadows move across the walls. Her stomach growled from hunger, but she had no strength to move. She closed her eyes, trying to escape into sleep. Then she heard it, faint, different from the usual sounds of chains and guards. It was a set of footsteps, slow, careful. Not the heavy boots of her captors, but softer, quieter. Her eyes snapped open, and she lifted her head. The others were too exhausted to notice, but she felt it clearly. Someone was there, walking through the tunnels in a way that didn't belong. Her heart beat faster. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a cruel trick of exhaustion. But the sound grew closer, echoing down the tunnel. She sat up, staring into the shadows. A figure moved between the rocks. It wasn't one of the guards. This shape was different, taller in a strange way. The air around her felt charged, as if something unusual had entered this world of darkness. She gripped her chains with trembling hands. If it was a guard, she would be punished for not lying still. But if it was not, then who could it be? No one came down here except the captors and the slaves. For years, she had seen no one new. Yet now, there was a presence, a stranger in the mines. The figure paused as if watching her. The dim light caught the edge of his face, and she froze. His features were unlike the others. His eyes glimmered differently, holding something she had not seen in anyone here, life. He was not one of her kind, but neither was he one of the cruel masters. He looked out of place, as if the darkness itself rejected him. She could not speak. Her throat felt dry, her voice long broken by silence. She only stared, her heart pounding. The stranger didn't move closer, but she felt his gaze, steady and strong. For a brief moment, she forgot her hunger, her pain, even the weight of the chains. Something inside her stirred. Fear, yes, but also a spark she had thought long gone. The footsteps faded again, moving away down another tunnel, leaving her in silence once more. She sank back against the wall, trembling. Was it real? Or just her mind creating illusions to survive the endless suffering? She closed her eyes tightly, trying to steady her breath. But one thought kept repeating in her mind, stronger than hunger, stronger than fear. Someone else was here. Someone different. For the first time in years, she felt something dangerous, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The next day was the same as always. She woke to the sound of chains rattling and guards shouting. The slaves rose slowly from the ground, their bodies stiff and sore, their faces dull like lifeless stone. She picked up her basket, heavy even before it was filled with rocks, and began walking with the others into the tunnels. Her back ached, her hands were raw, but no one cared. Work was the only command. Work until your body breaks. As she stumbled through the dim tunnel, she could not forget what she had seen the night before. The memory of that figure haunted her. The eyes that had looked so alive, the presence that felt so out of place in the mines. She told herself it must have been a dream, a trick of exhaustion. No one comes here. No one cares. And yet, deep inside, she could not shake the feeling that it had been real. Hours passed as she carried rocks and dug at the walls with broken tools. The guards lashed their whips at anyone who slowed down. She kept her head down, tried to blend into the sea of moving shadows. But when she returned to the water pit to drink, she noticed something strange. A small tin cup was sitting on the edge of the pit. Not broken like everything else down here. New. Clean. Too clean for this place. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. She looked around, but the guards were busy shouting at others. She bent down quickly, scooped some water, and drank. It tasted fresher somehow, cooler than before. It gave her a spark of strength she hadn't felt in years. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw him. He was standing in the shadows at the far end of the tunnel, half hidden by the rocks. His face was clearer this time. Strange clothes, not like the guards, not like any slave. His eyes were fixed on her again, sharp but not cruel. She froze with the cup in her hand. He raised one finger to his lips, the silent sign for her to stay quiet. Her heart raced. She almost dropped the cup, but she forced herself to nod slightly. He stepped back, blending into the shadows, as if he had never been there. All day, she thought of him. Who was he? Why was he here? No outsider ever entered the mines. The guards kept them sealed off from the world. She wondered if he was a ghost, a spirit of the tunnels. But ghosts don't leave clean cups, and ghosts don't look at you with eyes full of fire. That night, when the slaves were forced to lie down in the sleeping chamber, she waited. Her body was aching, but her mind was restless. The flickering lamps cast long, shaky shadows. The guards paced for a while, then left, locking the gate behind them. The chamber fell into silence. She listened. At first, there was nothing but the sound of weary breathing and chains rubbing against stone. Then she heard it, the soft footsteps again. She sat up slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. And there he was. The stranger moved carefully between the sleeping slaves, stepping silently, like someone trained to walk without sound. His face was clearer now under the faint light. His skin was different, his hair cut short, his jaw hard. He looked strong, but not like the guards who carried weapons and armor. His strength was quiet, hidden under calm eyes. When he reached her, she felt her throat close. She wanted to speak, but had no words. For so long, she had only used her voice to scream under the whip. Now she could not force sound out. He crouched beside her and held out a small piece of bread. Real bread. Soft, fresh, with the smell of grain. Her eyes widened. Her hands shook as she reached for it. She wanted to ask why, but his eyes gave her the answer, because he wanted to. She ate quickly, tears filling her eyes at the taste. It was more than food. It was life. He leaned closer and whispered, his voice low and strange but calm. She did not understand every word, but she caught enough. You are not forgotten. Hold on. Her chest tightened. Not forgotten. The words echoed in her mind like a prayer. She wanted to ask who he was, why he was helping her, but before she could, he pulled back. A sound came from the hallway, the guards returning. He pressed a finger to his lips again, then melted into the shadows. She blinked, and he was gone. When the guards entered, she was lying back on the ground, pretending to sleep, the taste of bread still on her tongue. For the first time in years, she did not feel like just a slave. Someone had seen her. Someone had cared enough to risk everything. She curled up on the cold floor, clutching the memory of his words like a secret flame. Not forgotten. The words burned in her heart long after the footsteps of the guards faded away. The following days passed like shadows, but everything felt different to her now. She still carried stones, still felt the lash of the guards if she slowed, still lay on the hard floor at night, but inside, she held a secret that gave her strength when she thought she had none left. The human stranger had returned twice more, each time bringing her something small but powerful. A sip of clean water, a crust of bread, a whispered word that reminded her she was alive. She began to wait for him. Every night, her eyes stayed open long after the others had fallen asleep. Her ears strained for the soft sound of his footsteps. And when he came, she felt the chains on her arms grow lighter, even though they still cut her skin. She started to notice things about him. He moved with care, as if he had walked these tunnels for years. He carried no whip, no chain, no cruel weapon like the guards. He carried silence, and silence in this place was dangerous. One night, he sat beside her longer than before. He handed her a small piece of dried meat, and when she ate, he spoke again. His words were broken, but she could understand enough. Tunnel, other way, freedom. He pointed into the darkness, down a passage no slave dared to go. She shook her head quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. The guards said those tunnels were cursed. Many slaves who tried to escape had gone there, and none returned. But his eyes held no fear, only certainty. He drew a shape in the dirt with his finger, a path. He pointed to her, then to himself, then to the path. It was a promise. He was planning to help her escape. Her breath caught in her chest. Escape was not a word slaves spoke. Escape was death, punishment, the sound of whips until your body gave up. But when she looked at him, she felt something she had not felt in years. Possibility. The next day, she carried her basket through the tunnels as usual, but her mind was no longer trapped in despair. She noticed the patterns of the guards' movements, the times when their eyes turned away. She began to realize that the human's plan was not madness. He was watching, studying, learning the rhythm of the underground. And she was learning with him. That night, he returned again. This time, he gave her something she never expected. A small shard of metal, sharp at one end. She gasped softly, almost dropping it. Tools, even broken ones, were never allowed in the sleeping chambers. If the guards found her with it, she would be whipped until she bled. She looked at him with wide eyes, shaking her head, but he pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. His meaning was clear. She needed it. Not just to cut ropes or pick locks, but to hold on to hope. She hid the shard under her thin blanket, her heart racing. That night she could not sleep. The idea of escape burned in her chest like fire. She imagined walking through that secret tunnel with him, breaking free from the chains, feeling fresh air on her face again. She imagined sunlight, though she could no longer remember what it looked like. But fear was always there. Fear of failure, fear of punishment. The guards had dogs that could smell fear, men who laughed as they hunted down escapees. If they were caught, he would die, and so would she. She turned to look at him, sleeping quietly in the shadows nearby. Why was he risking everything for her? He owed her nothing. And yet, here he was. The next morning, as she worked, a guard came too close. She stumbled, dropping her basket. The guard raised his whip, ready to strike. She flinched, bracing for pain, but then she saw him. The human was across the tunnel, pushing his own basket harder, faster, drawing the guard's attention away. The whip lashed at his back instead. He did not cry out, did not stop. He only kept moving. The guard cursed and followed him instead, leaving her untouched. Her chest ached as she watched him vanish around the corner. He had taken her punishment without hesitation. That night, when he returned to her side, she reached for him before he could speak. Her hand touched his wrist, trembling. It was the first time she had dared to touch another living being in years. Her eyes met his, and though no words came, he understood. Gratitude, trust, something deeper. From that night forward, she was no longer just surviving. She was waiting for the moment when they would try, when the chance for escape would come. And though fear still clawed at her heart, hope was louder now. The tunnels no longer looked endless. The chains no longer felt eternal. Because now she knew the truth. She was not alone. There was a human beside her, and he was not afraid. And if he was not afraid, then maybe, just maybe, she could learn not to be afraid either. The night was silent, except for the soft breathing of the slaves around her. The guards had left after their last round of checks, and the flickering lamps on the walls cast weak, dying light. She sat with her back against the stone, her hands clenched tightly. The human crouched beside her, his face serious. He whispered words she only half understood, but the meaning was clear enough. Tonight was the night. Her heart pounded in her chest. For so long she had dreamed of escape, but dreaming was different from doing. Now it was real. Her palms sweated as she touched the small shard of metal he had given her. She had hidden it in her blanket for days, and now she used it carefully to loosen the rusted lock on her chain. Every scrape of the shard against metal felt too loud, like a scream in the silence. She kept glancing at the entrance, terrified that the guards would return at any moment. At last, the lock gave way with a faint click. The chain around her wrist loosened. For the first time in years, she felt her hand free. Tears stung her eyes, but she did not let them fall. The human touched her arm lightly, urging her forward. He had already freed himself, and together they moved slowly through the chamber, stepping over the sleeping bodies of other slaves. Every sound felt dangerous. A cough, a shift, even a breath could betray them. They reached the gate. The lock was stronger than the ones on their chains, but the human was ready. He pulled a small piece of wire from his clothing and worked quickly. She watched, hardly breathing. Time dragged on painfully, but finally the lock clicked open. The gate creaked as they pushed it, and she froze. The sound was too loud, too sharp. She waited, listening. The tunnels remained quiet. The guards had not heard. Step by step, they slipped into the deeper tunnels, the ones the slaves were forbidden to enter. Darkness swallowed them, but the human moved with confidence. He carried a small light, shielded by his hand, just enough to guide their path without drawing attention. The air grew colder, damper, and the walls seemed to press in tighter as they went deeper. Her heart raced, but she kept following him. For a moment, she felt a wild rush of hope. Maybe they could truly make it out. Maybe freedom was not just a dream. But that hope shattered when the sound came. Distant at first, then closer. Boots striking stone, voices echoing through the tunnels. The guards had discovered the open gate. Her blood turned cold. She looked back in panic, but the human grabbed her hand firmly, pulling her forward. His eyes burned with determination, as if he had expected this. They ran, their chains clinking softly as they moved. The tunnels twisted and turned, every corner a new risk of running straight into their pursuers. The voices grew louder. The guards shouted, their words sharp and cruel, their footsteps fast. The chase had begun. She stumbled, her legs weak from years of exhaustion, but the human pulled her up again and again, never letting go. His grip was strong, unshakable, as if he carried not just himself, but her as well. They turned a corner, and there ahead was a group of guards blocking the path. Torches lit their faces, and weapons gleamed in their hands. She froze in terror, certain it was over. But the human stepped in front of her, his body shielding hers. The guards laughed when they saw him. One of them sneered, raising his whip. A human? Here? Their voices were mocking, cruel, certain that he was weak. They moved forward, ready to drag him down. But they were wrong. The human lunged with a sudden strength that shocked her. He moved faster than she thought possible, his fists striking with brutal force. He knocked the first guard to the ground before the others even reacted. A whip lashed across his back, but he did not stop. He grabbed the whip, yanked it from the guard's hand, and struck back with it. The crack echoed like thunder in the tunnel. She watched in disbelief as he fought. He was outnumbered, yet he did not hesitate. Every movement was precise, filled with a fury that no guard had expected. He moved not like a slave, not like prey, but like a warrior. The guards cursed, their torches falling as the fight turned against them. She could hear bones crack, hear the sound of weapons hitting stone. One guard tried to grab her, and she shrieked, backing away. But the human was there in an instant, pulling her free and striking the man down. His eyes flashed in the torchlight, fierce and unyielding. For the first time, the guards looked afraid. When the last one fell to the ground, groaning in pain, the tunnel went silent again. The human stood, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his arm. She stared at him, her mouth open, her heart racing. She had never seen anyone fight like that. She had never seen anyone fight for her. He turned to her, his expression calm despite the chaos. He touched her shoulder gently, urging her onward. "Not safe," he whispered. His voice was steady, but urgent. She nodded quickly, too shaken to speak. They left the defeated guards behind and ran deeper into the tunnels. Her body trembled, her mind spinning with shock. For so long she had believed humans were fragile, weak, unimportant. That was what the guards had always said. But tonight she had seen the truth with her own eyes. He was not weak, he was not afraid, and because of him, for the first time in her life, she truly believed they might escape. They ran until their legs could no longer carry them, the darkness of the tunnels stretching endlessly ahead. The sound of the guards had faded behind them, but fear still clung to her chest like a heavy stone. Every breath burned her lungs. Every step felt like it would be her last. She stumbled on loose rocks, and finally her foot caught on a jagged stone. She fell hard, her knees scraping against the rough ground. Pain shot up her leg, and she let out a weak cry. The human turned instantly. He knelt beside her, his hand gripping her arm, his eyes scanning her quickly. She shook her head, trying to stand, but her leg refused to move. A sharp pain throbbed in her ankle, and she realized it was worse than she thought. Fear struck her harder than the injury. If she couldn't walk, she would slow him down. And if the guards caught them, he would die because of her. Tears filled her eyes as she pushed at his chest weakly. She tried to tell him to go, to leave her behind, but he refused. His jaw tightened, and his eyes burned with the same fire she had seen before. He pulled her arm over his shoulder and lifted her. She gasped as he half-carried, half-dragged her forward through the tunnel. His movements were heavy now, but steady. Every step cost him strength, but he did not stop. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heart pounding hard under his skin. She whispered broken words, begging him to leave her, to save himself, but he only shook his head. "Together," he whispered firmly, the single word filled with unshakable resolve. They found an abandoned shaft, an old part of the mine that smelled of damp earth and forgotten dust. The wooden beams supporting it were cracked, the ground littered with broken tools and rusted chains. He lowered her gently to the ground against the wall, his breath harsh and ragged. She looked at him, guilt heavy in her chest. He had risked everything for her, and now she was nothing but a burden. Her ankle throbbed painfully, swollen and bruised. She tried to move it, but the pain was too sharp. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. He crouched before her, pulling a strip of cloth from his own shirt. Carefully, he wrapped it around her ankle, binding it tightly. His hands were rough, his fingers calloused, but his touch was gentle. She watched him work in silence, her chest tight with emotions she could not name. When he finished, he sat back, his shoulders slumped from exhaustion. His back was bleeding where the whip had struck him earlier, and his arm carried a deep cut from the fight. He was hurt badly, yet he hadn't cared. He had carried her instead of protecting himself. She stared at him, unable to understand why. No one in her life had ever done such a thing. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily. She studied his face, the lines of determination even in his rest. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. It was such a fragile word, but in his presence, she felt it. The silence of the old shaft wrapped around them. Somewhere far away, she could still hear the faint echo of guards shouting, but they were not close. For now, they had a little time. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched his arm. His eyes opened, and he looked at her. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything she felt, the gratitude, the fear, the strange hope blooming inside her, but the words refused to form. All she managed was a whisper, soft and broken. "Why, me?" His gaze held hers, steady and sure. He didn't answer right away, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, "Because no one should live in chains." The words hit her harder than any whip. They sank deep into her heart, breaking something inside her that had been locked away for years. No one had ever spoken for her before. No one had ever cared if she lived or died. And here was this human, bleeding and exhausted, risking everything just to give her a chance at life. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent but unstoppable. She covered her face with her hands, shaking. For the first time, she wasn't crying from pain or fear. She was crying because she felt seen, because someone believed she deserved more. The human moved closer, his hand brushing against hers, pulling her hands gently away from her face. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, it all felt unreal, like a dream she never wanted to end. They stayed like that for a long time, hidden in the forgotten shaft. She didn't know what the next hours would bring. The guards were still out there, searching. Their path ahead was uncertain, dangerous. But for the first time, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt trust. Her ankle still ached, her body still weak, but her spirit was no longer broken. The human had given her more than just a chance to live. He had given her the strength to believe in herself again. And as she leaned against him, she made a silent promise in her heart. She would not give up, not now, not ever. Because he believed in her, she would believe too. Together, they would find freedom, and no chain in the world would ever hold her again. The silence of the old shaft did not last long. Soon, the faint echoes of boots and torches grew closer again. The guards had not given up the hunt. She felt her stomach twist with fear, but when she looked at the human, his eyes were sharp and steady. He stood, helped her rise carefully, and motioned for her to lean on him. Her ankle was weak, but his arm around her gave her the strength to move. They followed the broken tunnels deeper, the ground sloping downward into places long forgotten. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth stronger. Old beams creaked above them, ready to collapse at any moment. She clung to his side, each step painful, but she refused to stop. Every sound behind them reminded her of the danger. They had only one chance to escape, and they could not waste it. Soon, they came to a wide cavern. The roof stretched high above, and broken mining carts lay scattered across the ground. Dozens of slaves were chained here, their faces pale and hopeless, their bodies frail from years of suffering. When the slaves saw the human and the girl, their eyes widened. They whispered in disbelief. A slave and an outsider, moving freely? It was something they had never imagined. The human looked around, his jaw set with determination. He moved to one of the chains and struck it with a heavy rock, breaking the rusted link. The sound echoed through the cavern, and the slaves gasped. One chain after another snapped as he worked, his arms straining, sweat dripping from his face. She limped forward to help, using her shard of metal to pry at the locks. Slowly, more and more slaves were freed. At first, they were afraid. Freedom sounded like death to them. The guards were too powerful, the punishment too harsh. But the human spoke, his voice strong and fierce. She didn't understand all his words, but the fire in his tone filled the cavern with courage. He pointed at the broken chains, then at the slaves themselves, then toward the tunnels leading upward. His meaning was clear. Together, they had a chance. The slaves looked at one another, their fear shifting into something else, hope. One by one, they nodded, their eyes burning with a light that had been gone for years. The girl felt her heart race. For so long, she thought she was alone in her suffering. But now, she saw strength growing around her. The human was giving them all something greater than food or water. He was giving them the will to fight. But time was short. The sound of guards shouting grew louder, echoing closer and closer. The human grabbed a rusted metal bar from the ground, swinging it in his hands like a weapon. He turned to the freed slaves, raising his voice again. Though she could not understand every word, she felt the power in them. It was a call to rise, a call to fight. The first guards stormed into the cavern, their torches blazing. They laughed when they saw the freed slaves, calling them weak, broken, worthless. They expected the prisoners to cower, but this time, no one bent their heads. With the human at the front, they rose together. Stones, chains, and broken tools became weapons in their hands. The fight was brutal. The guards swung whips and blades, their torches burning bright in the dark, but the slaves outnumbered them, and for the first time, they fought back with everything they had. The human struck hard, his movements sharp and unyielding. He knocked weapons from the guards' hands, defended the weak, and pushed forward with relentless force. His courage spread like fire, turning fear into strength. She limped through the chaos, her shard of metal gripped tightly. When a guard lunged at her, she ducked and struck at his arm. The cut was small, but it was enough to give another slave the chance to knock him down. Her hands trembled, but she did not stop. The human's fire had reached her too. The cavern roared with the clash of chains against steel, the shouts of men, and the cries of the slaves who refused to bend anymore. Slowly, the tide turned. The guards who had once ruled the tunnels with cruelty now stumbled back, overwhelmed by the rage of those they had beaten for years. When the last guard fell, silence returned. The slaves stood panting, their bodies shaking, their hands covered in dirt and blood. They looked at one another, stunned by what they had done. They were no longer just slaves. They had fought. They had won. The human stood at the center, his chest heaving, his face marked with sweat and blood. He looked at them all, his eyes burning with pride. He did not need words. His very presence told them what they needed to know. They were free, but only if they kept moving. She hobbled to his side, her heart pounding. The slaves gathered around them, their faces turned upward, waiting. She realized something in that moment. This man, this human who had come from nowhere, had done more than save her. He had broken the chains of everyone here. He had shown them that freedom was not impossible. He turned to her then, his hand brushing her arm as he guided her forward. His touch was steady, grounding her in the midst of all the chaos. For the first time, she felt like the chains were not just off her wrists. They were gone from her heart as well. The tunnels above were still waiting, the danger not yet over. The guards would return with more soldiers, stronger ones. But now they were not two running in fear. They were many, united by a single hope. Together, with the human leading them, they would climb out of the darkness. And as she looked into his eyes, she understood the truth. He had given her more than life. He had given her a reason to fight, a reason to believe. And that reason was stronger than any chain. The march upward felt endless. The tunnels twisted like a maze, every corner filled with shadows that could hide enemies. Torches stolen from the guards flickered in trembling hands as the group of freed slaves followed the human and the girl. Their chains clinked softly, not as prisons now, but as reminders of what they had broken. Every step upward was a step closer to life, yet also a step closer to danger. The human led with quiet strength, his eyes sharp, scanning every turn. The girl leaned on him when her ankle faltered, but she no longer felt like a burden. Around her, she saw faces that had once been empty, now filled with fire. People whispered softly to each other, words of hope they had not dared to speak for years. It was strange, almost unreal, like a dream walking. But the dream almost shattered when they reached a wide tunnel near the surface. Shouts erupted ahead, and the glow of torches spilled into the dark. Dozens of guards waited, forming a wall of steel and fire. Their commander stood at the front, his voice echoing with cruelty as he mocked the sight of filthy slaves thinking they could run. Fear rippled through the group. Many froze, trembling at the sight of so many enemies. Some looked ready to fall to their knees, to beg for mercy. The girl felt her heart clench. After everything, would it end here? But then she looked at the human. He stepped forward, standing tall, his body battered and bloodied, but his spirit unbroken. He raised the rusted bar he carried, as if it were a sword, his eyes burning with a fire that cut through the fear around him. He shouted, his voice raw but fierce, a sound that carried strength into every heart that heard it. She didn't understand all his words, but she understood his meaning. They had come too far to stop now. The slaves roared, their voices shaking the tunnel walls. They picked up rocks, chains, broken tools, whatever they could wield. Fear turned into fury. Chains that had once held them now swung as weapons. They surged forward together, led by the human's unstoppable will. The clash was like thunder. Guards swung blades, but slaves fought back with desperation and rage. The tunnel filled with cries, metal striking stone, firelight flashing against sweat and blood. The girl fought too, her shard of metal slashing whenever an enemy came too close. Her ankle screamed with pain, but her spirit refused to break. She was no longer running. She was fighting for her life, for freedom, for everything stolen from her. The human was everywhere. He struck down guards with raw strength, his movements fueled not just by power but by purpose. He defended the weak, pulled fallen slaves back to their feet, and pressed forward without pause. His fury was not wild, it was controlled, sharp, burning with a focus that terrified his enemies. The guards, so used to obedience and fear, began to falter. At one point, the commander charged at the girl, his blade raised high. She froze, her shard trembling in her hand. But before the blade could fall, the human appeared, blocking the strike with his bar of metal. The sound rang like a bell, sparks flying. The commander sneered, calling him weak, but the human's answer was a strike so fierce it sent the man crashing to the ground. Gasps echoed through the tunnel. The symbol of their oppression had fallen. The fight turned after that. The guards, seeing their leader broken, lost their will. One by one, they were overwhelmed, pushed back, beaten down by those they had enslaved. At last, silence filled the tunnel again, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. The slaves stood tall, victorious, their chains hanging loose in their hands. The human dropped the bent bar from his hand, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Blood dripped from his wounds, yet his eyes still burned with fire. He turned to the girl, reaching out his hand. She took it, her heart swelling with something she had never known before. Together, they climbed the final steps of the tunnel. The air grew fresher with every breath. The damp smell of stone gave way to something lighter, cleaner. And then at last, they reached the surface. The first touch of air on her skin made her gasp. It was cool, crisp, alive. She stumbled out into the open, the light of dawn spilling across the land. The sky stretched endlessly above her, painted with colors she had forgotten existed. She lifted her face, eyes closing as the warmth of the sun touched her for the first time in years. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from pain, but from wonder. The other slaves emerged behind her, their cries filling the air as they looked at the sky, the earth, the light. Some fell to their knees, kissing the ground. Others laughed through tears. The world above was more beautiful than any of them had remembered, because now it was theirs again. The girl turned to the human. He stood at her side, watching the horizon with quiet pride. He had given them all this moment. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried everything in her heart. "Thank you." He looked at her, a faint smile breaking through his tired face. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His eyes said everything, that this was only the beginning. The slaves were no longer slaves. They were free people walking into a new life. And she, who had once believed she would die in chains, now stood beneath the open sky with the human who had given her back her soul. The chains were gone forever. And with the rising sun, a new journey had begun.